Walk into a medieval great hall, and you'll see a warm fire, long wooden tables, and plenty of food. It looks welcoming, but that is a dangerous illusion. You aren't here to enjoy a meal. You're here to navigate a high-stakes social system where every minor action is a test of survival. In a modern world, a chair is just a piece of furniture, but in a medieval castle, seating is a perfectly organized hierarchy. Sitting in the wrong spot isn't just a social gaffe, it's a public statement that you outrank people with more power than you. In this world, that decision can cost you your safety. This manuscript illustrates how rigid that ladder was. The Lord sits at the far end, elevated and centered. Below him are nobles, knights, and servants. Everyone understands their exact rung on the ladder, and they are constantly watching you. Speaking follows the same invisible boundaries. Conversation isn't open, it is granted by rank. If you offer an uninvited opinion or interrupt a noble, you aren't just being rude, you are disrupting the order of the castle. In a world built on absolute hierarchy, those disruptions are corrected quickly and publicly. Even your hands have to learn discipline. Reaching for a piece of bread can be seen as taking property that isn't yours. Holding eye contact with someone of higher rank can be interpreted as a challenge. Here, silence and stillness aren't awkward. They are the only safe ways to exist. For centuries, survival meant blending into these structures. The goal wasn't to stand out or be impressive. It was to remain as invisible as possible within the rules of the room. But not every society chose to live behind these walls. Thousands of years before the rise of Rome, the Minoans of Crete built a civilization on trade and connection. Instead of heavy land-based defenses, they focused their energy on the sea, creating a maritime network that prioritized movement over containment. Their administrative centers showed just how much they trusted this openness. The ruins of Knossos have no massive defensive walls or fortresses. They were sprawling, intricate complexes built with open courtyards and exposed columns, leaving the heart of their power completely unshielded. Their artwork reflects this rejection of rigid control. The Minoans focused on motion. These figures aren't fighting the bull, they're leaping over it, turning danger into performance. Looking at the rest of the fresco, there are no weapons or scenes of conquest. Their imagery focused on rhythm rather than power. This lack of physical and social rigidity made them exceptionally productive, but it also left them defenseless. When the Thera volcano erupted, forming this massive crater, the resulting tsunamis shattered their ports. Their power was built on a network of movement, and once those connections were broken, the entire civilization began to unravel. The Minoans prove that removing rigid constraints allows for a more expressive society, but it also removes the safety nets that protect a civilization from sudden external chaos, leaving them fully exposed. In the workshops of Cremona, craftsmen sought a way to capture that same human expression without the fragility. They wanted an instrument that didn't just play notes, but could cry, whisper, and tremble like the human voice. The violin only produces its fluid, emotional voice through obsessive physical discipline. Every curve of the wood is mathematically precise, and the strings are held under severe tension. It is a rigid, unforgiving system, offering no shortcuts. When Niccolò Paganini took up this tool, he used its rigid boundaries to force a new level of performance. He pushed his fingers to impossible speeds, using the severe constraints of the instrument to shatter the musical limits of the 19th century. This intensity was so unfamiliar that audiences struggled to explain it. Because they couldn't see the years of relentless practice, they created legends instead, claiming Paganini's skill was a deal with the devil. Paganini demonstrated that a rigid system, when mastered to the point of obsession, doesn't have to be a cage. In the right hands, those very constraints become the mechanics needed to project a voice that can cut through a room. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart spent his early life inside a social cage. In Salzburg, he was a servant in the aristocratic patronage system. He was expected to wear the formal red coat of the court, follow the archbishop's orders, and compose only what was deemed appropriate. He chose to break that system. He forced his own dismissal and moved to Vienna to live as a freelance artist. In a world where your status and income depended entirely on a lord's approval, it was a decision trading social security for creative independence. Look at the sheer density of these scores. Without a patron, Mozart's music became complex. These erratic notations show him pushing into unrefined territory. This overlapping complexity is why he struggled. Refusing to simplify meant unstable income. He created music to outlast the era, but the wealthy found it too demanding. His letters from this time are a record of the physical and psychological toll of that independence. As he produced his greatest masterpieces, he was also writing constant, desperate requests for loans just to keep his household running. Mozart gained the freedom to rewrite the rules of music, but by stepping out of the hierarchy, he also lost the protection that the system provided to those who followed them. By the winter of 1791, Mozart was feverish and exhausted. He was spending his final weeks dictating the Requiem, a mass for the dead, while his body was visibly failing. He worked with the urgency of a man who knew his time was running out. He died at 35, and because he had spent years living in financial precarity outside the patronage system, he was buried in a common, unmarked grave. It was a standard burial for a citizen of his status, but it remains a stark contrast to the scale of the legacy he left behind. The outliers of history often face these consequences. The Minoans, with their open society, were absorbed by the more militaristic cultures that followed. Paganini's technical skill made him a figure of fear, and Mozart's independence led to a life of constant instability. They are the opposite of the rule followers at the medieval banquet. Those who stayed in their assigned seats and followed the invisible etiquette of the castle often lived long, secure lives, and then they were forgotten. History suggests that we face a recurring choice. To follow the established rules of an era is the safest way to survive within it. But the individuals and civilizations that define an era are almost always the ones who were willing to risk their survival to break its system. Imagine waking up every day knowing your entire world could end by sunset. A sudden plague could empty your village. A bad harvest meant mass starvation, and the next raid over the hill could wipe out your family. When every sudden fever or thunderclap could be a death sentence, life becomes a series of desperate bargains. People scanned every crow's flight and every failed rain for a hint of their own ruin, searching for some kind of logic in a world that felt entirely random. Physical defenses like stone walls and forts were never enough to guarantee survival. To keep the panic at bay, ancient and medieval civilizations engineered elaborate psychological systems to convince themselves they had control over the uncontrollable. To stave off the dark, civilization relied on three fragile human inventions: sacred figures to appease the cosmos, communal traditions to vent human aggression, and singular leaders to hold empires together by sheer force of will. Rome was a city perpetually stressed about the whims of its gods. To manage this cosmic anxiety, the empire placed its entire fate on the shoulders of 6 young girls, known as the Vestal Virgins. These priestesses were drafted as children and bound to an exacting standard of physical purity. Their core duty was to maintain Vesta's sacred fire day and night, essentially acting as the spiritual life support for millions of people. If that eternal flame flickered out, the city instantly spiraled into panic, assuming divine catastrophe was imminent. If a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow, she faced a theatrical and horrifying punishment. She was buried alive in an underground chamber to restore Rome's perceived spiritual balance. Hundreds of miles away in the rugged mountains of ancient Illyria, spiritual order looked entirely different. Here, there were no strict marble temples, but rather a wild, nature-based environment, overseen by revered tribal priestesses. These women mitigated societal chaos by reading omens in the shifting winds and the crackling of sacred fires. With these natural signs, they held the authority to halt violent tribal blood feuds, mediate clan disputes, and dictate exactly when warriors could march. Despite the stark contrast between Rome's rigid marble columns and Illyria's untamed sacred groves, both systems served the exact same purpose. They provided terrified societies with a psychological anchor, granting them the illusion that they could control the cosmic forces surrounding them. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and the chaos-threatening society shifted from cosmic anxiety to the localized friction of physical violence and strict class divides. To keep these tensions from fracturing the community, medieval culture developed its own release valve: highly localized, highly physical communal sports. Take medieval peasant football. There were virtually no rules, no limits on the number of players, and matches often resembled a muddy, village-wide mass brawl over a leather ball. It provided a loud, aggressive, and necessary physical release from the endless grind of agricultural labor. Similarly, communal wrestling gave peasants an outlet to settle tavern disputes with a clean throw in the dirt, preventing personal grudges from escalating into deadly blood feuds. Step across the moat, however, and the nobility engaged in an entirely different, highly exclusive realm of play. Aristocratic hawking operated on its own strict logic. It served as a quiet, theatrical display of land ownership, wealth, and the strategic patience required to train a bird of prey. Then there was the jousting tournament. These highly choreographed events simulated the strict rules of warfare, keeping knights militarily sharp, while ensuring the public witnessed their martial superiority. By formalizing where a peasant could grapple and where a knight could charge, these games gave everyone a designated place to expend their energy. It was a way for the entire village to practice the roles they were expected to play, reinforcing the boundaries of their world through the dirt of the field and the pageantry of the lists. Sometimes the pillar holding back the chaos isn't a tradition or a priesthood. In the oppressive heat of Babylon in 323 BCE, the entire civilized world rested on the shoulders of a single man. Alexander the Great, the undefeated conqueror of Asia, was suddenly struck by a mysterious fever. As his body collapsed, his battle-hardened generals watched in silence, paralyzed by the sight of their supposedly immortal leader failing. His impending death created a terrifying geopolitical vacuum. Alexander had no clear adult heir ready to inherit a vast territory that stretched from Greece all the way to the edges of India. When pressed by his commanders about who should inherit the greatest empire on earth, the dying king managed one final whisper: "To the strongest." Those 3 words shattered the unity of the empire, sparking a ruthless scramble for power among his ambitious generals. This initial fracture ignited decades of civil war. The men who had conquered the world together spent the rest of their lives tearing it apart. The empire didn't vanish overnight, but the anchor was gone. Without Alexander's singular will to bind them, the very men who had built this world together began the slow, bloody process of dismantling it, proving that even the largest empires are only as stable as the people holding the center. Our spiritual pillars eventually faded into history, though their end arrived through quiet, gradual shifts in society rather than sudden apocalyptic disasters. The eternal flame of the Vestal Virgins was deliberately extinguished by government decree as Christianity rose to power. Meanwhile, the revered Illyrian priestesses were slowly absorbed into local mountain folklore as Roman conquest tightened its administrative grip on their homeland. These foundational systems ended simply because the societies that invented them rewrote their own identities. They stopped believing in the old magic, and so the magic lost its power. Whether it's a sacred Roman fire, a muddy medieval peasant game, or an undefeated king's dying breath, the structures preventing chaos are entirely human inventions, and they only survive as long as humanity collectively agrees to keep playing by the rules. 4.7 million years ago, waking up alive and uneaten was a statistical anomaly. Our ancestors didn't start the day with morning stretches. They started by scanning the grass for any sign of a predator that had spent the night waiting for them to move. Survival was a relentless physical gamble. You ate berries and hoped they weren't toxic, then drank from parasite-laden streams because the alternative was dying of thirst before sunset. We had no physical advantages. This skull shows the reality. No claws, no thick hide, and a complete lack of natural weaponry like predatory fangs. To any large cat or serpent, we were a soft, slow target. Our first true weapon wasn't made of stone, it was the group. Social hierarchy and cooperation functioned as a collective insurance policy. Standing alone meant a short lifespan, but moving in a pack allowed us to spot danger early and share the burden of staying alive. Primitive grunts and gestures communicated immediate risks, like an approaching snake or a nearby carcass. Yet this same proximity birthed the first social friction. Disputes over who occupied the safest spot in the tree, or who controlled the day's forage. Humanity eventually conquered the food chain and built walls to keep the wilderness out. But the struggle for survival persisted, shifting the battlefield from the open plains to the complex world of human politics. In 6th century Constantinople, the threats were no longer lions, but the rigid hierarchies of the Byzantine Empire. Empress Theodora was born as a destitute actress in the city's lower class, a position of extreme social and economic vulnerability. She secured her path forward through wit and a calculated rebranding of her image. By trading her scandalous reputation for one of modesty and intelligence, she navigated the cutthroat circles of the aristocracy to find allies in high places. Her marriage to Emperor Justinian was a strategic alliance that broke the era's legal barriers. Justinian rewrote the law specifically to allow their union, merging his military and legal ambitions with her sharp social instincts. During the Nika Revolt, those instincts saved the throne. When Justinian prepared to flee the burning city, Theodora's psychological resolve shamed the court into staying. Her defiance gave the generals the opening they needed to crush the rebellion and restore order. This vast infrastructural legacy was secured by that resolve. Theodora stood as a co-sovereign, advising on state policy and helping manage an empire that stretched across the Mediterranean. She then weaponized imperial law to protect the class she came from. She enacted reforms that gave women property rights and established refuges for those trapped in trafficking, using the mechanisms of the throne to shield the vulnerable. Theodora's life demonstrates that in a civilized society, the capacity for reinvention and political maneuvering provides the new framework for survival. Survival also operates on the macro level, where civilizations compete for dominance. In 845 AD, the Frankish kingdom faced a massive, coordinated threat from the north. Ragnar Lodbrok's fleet moved up the Seine in rhythmic unison, a military machine capable of moving 5,000 warriors deep into the kingdom's heart. Ragnar bypassed the city's walls and focused on its supply lines. By anchoring across both channels of the Seine, he choked off the flow of resources, effectively turning the river into a prison for the people of Paris. The engineering of these vessels was key. Their shallow draft allowed the fleet to dominate riverways too narrow for traditional Frankish defenses. As famine weakened the city from within, the fleet's constant presence eroded the population's will. Ragnar waited as internal defenses collapsed. The blockade was so effective that King Charles the Bald was forced to pay an unprecedented ransom of 7,000 pounds of silver just to convince the Northmen to row away. Ragnar secured a total victory through economic strangulation and psychological pressure, proving that a kingdom could be brought to its knees without a single soldier scaling the walls. In times of relative peace, ambition goes undercover. In the late Middle Ages, the royal court became a covert battlefield where status was won and lost through the appearance of refinement. Dances like the pavane were highly codified arenas for political posturing. These weren't mere entertainment, they were public performances designed to display wealth, breeding, and social rank. The rigid structure of these dances allowed nobles to communicate.
A deeper bow or lingering hand signaled alliance, maintaining absolute decorum. This made the dance master a critical strategist, shielding families from social ruin following a clumsy performance. A misstep on the dance floor didn't result in physical death, but it could fatally wound a family's standing and their chances of political survival in the king's favor. Whether on a prehistoric plain, in a Byzantine throne room, or a medieval ballroom, the underlying drive is the same. The environments and the weapons have evolved, but the human operating system of strategic ambition remains identical across every era. The anxiety of a hunter trying to stay within the pack is biologically tied to the noble navigating court protocol. Both are driven by the necessity to secure their place in the social hierarchy. We never stopped fighting for our survival. We simply shifted the struggle into increasingly sophisticated arenas, refining the same core drive to secure our future.
Early humans evolved in the warm climates of Africa, losing most of their thick body hair to help with sweating and endurance hunting. But as global temperatures dropped and creeping ice sheets covered massive portions of the planet, our lack of fur became a lethal biological liability. Humanity faced a brutally simple equation: invent practical ways to stay warm and consume massive amounts of calories, or go extinct. We survived by draping animal skins over our shoulders and foraging for every available calorie. But because of our complex psychology, our species is incapable of leaving a practical solution alone. Once the threat of freezing was handled, humans began to scrutinize one another. They noticed whose fur was cleaner, who wore softer hides, or who stitched beads into cloaks, effectively turning survival equipment into a visible scorecard for social rank. From luxury fashion and class warfare to high-stakes political diplomacy, the complex rituals of modern society trace directly back to that transition. They are accidental mutations of our primitive instinct to simply not freeze or starve. The first major technological leap was the bone needle. By piercing tiny holes in thick hides and threading animal sinew, humans created fitted, layered garments. This trapped body heat efficiently and allowed populations to migrate deep into frozen environments without immediately dying. Almost immediately, people began using those layers to show off. A hunter wearing cleaner furs or a cloak decorated with polished wolf teeth signaled that they had the skills, time, and resources to thrive. Utility became a display of social rank. Fast forward a few thousand years, and this primal status signaling became encoded into government regulations. Rulers across Europe and Asia instituted sumptuary laws, strict legal codes dictating exactly which fabrics, patterns, and colors each social class was permitted to wear. This scale visualization shows exactly how extreme that control became. To produce a single tiny drop of Tyrian purple dye, laborers had to harvest and process 10,000 rotting sea snails. That astronomical cost meant only royalty could afford it, transforming a specific color into the ultimate symbol of imperial elite status. Clothing had stopped protecting humanity from the weather. It was now an engineered system designed to protect the wealthy from social mobility. The second biological threat, starvation, required an equally massive effort. Surviving the harsh winters of antiquity meant entire communities had to work to the point of physical exhaustion to stockpile heavy amounts of calories. In ancient Gaul, families weaponized weddings to secure tribal alliances, using the sheer volume of roasted pork and ale to broadcast their prosperity and reliability as a partner. Centuries later, medieval harvest festivals operated on the exact same logic. After months of grueling labor in muddy fields, distributing roasted pork and barrels of cheap ale served as a vital psychological pressure valve for an exhausted peasantry. These gatherings were deeply tied to spiritual survival as well. Refusing to share food with the community or failing to leave an offering for the gods was widely believed to invite disease, failed harvests, or total tribal collapse. These gatherings functioned as a vital social technology.
By forcing tribes to eat and drink together, communities engineered the mutual trust they needed to survive future wars and winter famines. When human populations scaled into massive urban centers, the biological need for calories birthed the mechanics of statecraft. In the Byzantine Empire, feeding the hundreds of thousands of citizens crammed inside Constantinople was a terrifying daily logistical operation. This map shows the supply lines keeping the capital functioning, with grain constantly flowing into a single urban choke point. Imperial officials monitored these routes heavily, knowing a single disruption meant instant revolt. Looking closely, the map splits into two visual layers, revealing a strict physical separation of classes. Wealthy nobility relied on sprawling, expensive routes for imported spices, while laborers depended entirely on the localized distribution of cheap lentils and salted fish. The entire administrative machinery of one of history's greatest empires relied on a very delicate balancing act, managing the primitive human panic of missing a single daily meal. Today, we have technically defeated the original Ice Age threats. Through sprawling industrial infrastructure, we completely removed the daily threat of freezing to death. We industrialized the caloric equation, building massive machines capable of harvesting enough grain to feed millions of people with a fraction of the historical labor. The desperate, chaotic harbor markets of antiquity have been replaced by endless, perfectly organized aisles of overwhelming abundance. And while mass production has made stitched clothing universally accessible, our primal psychology remains completely intact. We still use fabric exactly as our ancestors used polished wolf teeth. We wear certain brands to signal exclusivity, enforce our belonging to specific in-groups, and compete fiercely for social status. We also use perfectly identical garments to strip away individual identity, projecting institutional power and intimidation on massive scales. The physical threats of the Ice Age are long gone. The emotional armor and the social rituals we invented to survive them have become the permanent, invisible architecture of human civilization. Look at the sweep of history, and it is easy to assume empires fall because of geography or economics. But trace the cracks in a collapsing state, and you will often find something much pettier: the emotional immaturity of the person in charge. Take King John of England in the early 13th century. He inherited a vast kingdom, but his legacy is a masterclass in catastrophic tantrums. He taxed his nobles into open rebellion and managed to lose most of his French territories in a single fit of rage disguised as a military campaign. His erratic behavior became such a threat to the stability of the realm that his own barons cornered him. They forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a desperate legal mechanism designed to physically restrain a king who could not control himself. 3 centuries later, Russia experienced a similar brand of dysfunction. Ivan the Terrible started his reign with ambition, but eventually descended into severe paranoia. His court became a minefield of mass executions and unpredictable violence. This volatility reached a boiling point in 1581 over something entirely trivial. Ivan violently attacked his pregnant daughter-in-law simply because he decided her clothing was inappropriate. When his highly competent eldest son confronted him about the attack, words escalated. In a blind rage, Ivan struck his heir across the head with a metal scepter, killing him. That single swing of a scepter eliminated the only capable successor, plunging the Russian state into a devastating period of famine and civil war, known as the Time of Troubles. Or look at Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, who charged headfirst into a well-defended Swiss army out of sheer reckless pride. He died in the snow, leaving his 19-year-old daughter to inherit a vulnerable, ruined kingdom. When a leader lacks emotional control, their flaws are weaponized against their own state. Anger and impulse create power vacuums. So, if short-term reactivity destroys nations, what specific character trait is required to actually build and sustain one? To find the answer, we have to look far outside the royal courts of Europe, to societies where survival meant suppressing human ego and quietly studying the environment. In ancient Mesopotamia,
Babylonian priests acted as early meteorologists. They didn't try to force the skies to their will. Instead, they climbed massive temple towers to clear the horizon, spending generations patiently cataloging cloud formations and celestial movements to predict incoming floods or droughts. The stakes were even higher in ancient Egypt. Without the annual flooding of the Nile River, the crops would wither and the entire civilization would starve. They couldn't control the river, but they could anticipate it through an astronomical concept called heliacal rising. They tracked a single exceptionally bright star, Sirius. Every year, Sirius appeared on the eastern horizon just before dawn. This celestial alarm clock meant the Nile would swell within days. Plant too early, seeds washed away. Wait too long, the season was lost. Their society rested on waiting for the perfect moment. Thousands of miles away, Polynesian wavefinders applied this same rigorous patience to the ocean. They navigated vast stretches of open water entirely by reading subtle shifts in wave refraction and the shapes of distant clouds.
These ancient cultures thrived because they understood a fundamental rule of statecraft. Power doesn't come from forcing the world to match your own internal timeline. It comes from adapting to the reality around you. But what happens when that ancient, disciplined observation is weaponized in cutthroat politics? For that, we turn to the fallout of Julius Caesar's assassination. The senators who stabbed Caesar on the Ides of March believed they were saving Rome. They thought one sudden, violent act would instate dictatorship and restore the old republic. They were disastrously wrong. They expected the public to cheer, but they had no plan for the day after the murder. Instead of restoring order, their bloody spectacle ignited a massive, uncontrollable civil war. Into this chaos stepped Caesar's 18-year-old adopted heir, Octavian. While the older, seasoned politicians panicked and scrambled for immediate dominance, the teenager did the exact opposite.
Octavian played a meticulous long game. He quietly borrowed money to fulfill Caesar's financial promises to the public, slowly courted loyal military veterans, and formed temporary alliances to eliminate his rivals one by one, eventually outmaneuvering Mark Antony. It took years of cold calculation, but by the time the dust settled, Octavian was the last man standing, transforming the broken republic into a unified Roman Empire. A centuries-old political system was shattered by impulsive men with daggers, but the empire that replaced it was built by a teenager who mastered the art of waiting. No historical figure embodies this principle quite like Tokugawa Ieyasu. If the medieval kings of Europe were defined by their explosive tempers, Ieyasu was history's grand master of political timing. Born into the violent chaos of Japan's Warring States period, he spent his childhood being traded as a political hostage between rival clans. To survive, he learned to suppress his ego entirely and observe the shifting power dynamics from the shadows. As an adult, he maintained that discipline for decades. He served as a loyal vassal to brilliant but volatile warlords like Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi. While they exhausted their resources on flashy military campaigns, Ieyasu quietly developed his local economy, reformed his lands, and built a loyal army. His restraint culminated in the year 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara, where he faced off against a massive coalition of rival lords. The battle didn't hinge on a reckless headfirst charge. Ieyasu had spent weeks secretly negotiating with commanders inside the enemy camp. When the fighting reached a stalemate, he triggered a coordinated betrayal at the exact right psychological moment, causing the opposing army to collapse in on itself. That single, perfectly timed victory allowed him to eliminate his remaining rivals, claim the title of shogun, and effectively end over a century of continuous civil war. Whether it's watching a star edge above the horizon to feed an entire civilization, or waiting 60 years to unify a nation, the historical record is remarkably consistent. True power doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the fastest sword. It belongs to those who observe, wait, and strike only when the time is exactly right.
To a medieval peasant, a calf born with two faces was a terrifying divine warning that the heavens were deeply angry. In ancient Rome, a political disagreement could instantly explode into a flurry of crude clubs and broken cobblestones, leaving the public running for their lives. Centuries later, a lone teenager on the American frontier pushes an exhausted horse through a blinding mountain blizzard, risking his life just to move a leather mail pouch across the country. And in Constantinople, the city's marketplace forced a silk-clad noble and a barefoot dockworker to stand shoulder to shoulder, sharing the exact same honey-soaked pastry. These moments are united by a common reality. For most of history, humans lacked the scientific tools or legal infrastructure to manage rapid change. To survive, they had to invent wild, brilliant, and sometimes brutal systems to manufacture meaning out of a chaotic void. If you lived in medieval Europe, scientific ignorance was a daily threat. Without a working knowledge of biology or meteorology, a ruined crop or a sudden thunderstorm felt like a targeted supernatural event. This 19th century engraving illustrates St. Elmo's fire. During violent storms, strong electric fields cause atmospheric plasma to form, creating bright blue glows at high points, like the upper tips of these masts. It is a harmless meteorological event, but a medieval sailor saw a cosmic announcement. They dropped to their knees in terror, convinced they were being visited by glowing angels or furious demons. This same instinct defined their record-keeping. Look at the formal Latin text accompanying this illustration. Monks documented physical mutations as official records of impending doom, treating biological accidents as literal prophecies. Assigning blame to witches or angry gods gave villagers a psychological sense of control. If a tragedy had a supernatural cause, it had a solution, providing a way to navigate a universe they couldn't otherwise explain. In the late Roman Republic, chaos took the form of a total collapse in law enforcement. As you can see in this view of the ancient Appian Way, Rome lacked a formal police force, leaving a dangerous void in civic protection. Ambitious politicians like Clodius and Milo stepped into this vacuum. They began financing local neighborhood clubs, or collegia, converting social groups into organized street militias loyal to their bank accounts. These gangs quickly turned the streets of Rome into a tactical map. They used hidden daggers and heavy clubs to disrupt public assemblies and chase rivals away from the forum, ensuring that the ballot box belonged to whichever side arrived with the most muscle. Eventually, the Senate grew so terrified of the mobs that they granted absolute power to a single military figure. This classical bust, with its stern, rigid expression, represents the martial order that finally silenced the Republic's streets. The Roman experience shows that when civic structures fail to guarantee basic safety, the resulting insecurity makes military authority feel like a necessary trade for survival. In 1860, the United States was threatened by a different kind of void. This map highlights the massive geographic gap between Missouri and California. With a civil war approaching, that 1,800-mile silence risked permanently fracturing the nation. To bridge this, private businessmen built a chain of relay stations, spaced just 10 miles apart. This was an engineering feat of sheer logistics, designed to move mail across the frontier through a relay of desperate, high-speed sprints. The physical dangers were extreme. Riders crossed the Sierra Nevada in blizzards and navigated through hostile territory alone. They carried almost no weapons, sacrificing their own safety to keep the mail moving at a gallop. This photograph shows a young Buffalo Bill Cody, one of the original couriers. The job required skinny, wiry teenagers, often orphans, with the reflexes to survive a job that demanded they risk death daily. The Pony Express was a psychological lifeline. It was an act of human defiance, using sheer grit to force a physical connection across an untamed landscape when the country was most fragile. In Constantinople, the chaos came from a high-density collision of cultures. This view of the Hagia Sophia captures the scale of a city where Greek, Roman, Persian, and Arabic influences were constantly overlapping. Packing that many distinct populations into a single walled city invited social friction. Yet Constantinople found a stabilizing mechanism in its street food scene. Vendors combined the ingredients of different empires into single dishes.
Loukoumades, or honey pastries, blended ancient Greek honey with Persian cinnamon and Roman nuts, physically merging the tastes of these disparate cultures. These stalls provided a rare communal space where social lines blurred. Whether you were an off-duty soldier, a monk, or a wealthy aristocrat, you stood in the same crowd to buy the same hot, honey-soaked meal. In a culturally fractured city, the shared ritual of a meal provided a basic social glue. These simple interactions helped maintain the common identity necessary to keep an empire from splintering. Terrified medieval monks, Roman gangs, frontier riders, and Byzantine vendors were all participants in the same human struggle. They were each trying to solve the problem of uncertainty. Today, we manage the unknown through weather apps, smartphones, and instantaneous global networks. If the sky glows blue, we search for a scientific explanation rather than a divine one, but the instant remains the same. When our modern systems wobble, we still feel the drive to aggressively impose order on a shifting world. History records our coping mechanisms. When the universe stops making sense, humanity will always build something, a myth, a system, or even a simple meal, to remind ourselves that we can survive the chaos. Picture a gladiator raising a sword to a roaring crowd, a medieval villager trapped in a wooden barrel, and a crusader pouring spiced wine. On the surface, these seem disconnected, but they are all solutions to the exact same problem: maintaining control. Relying strictly on brute force breeds rebellion, and written laws are remarkably easy to ignore. To secure authority, the state must ensure citizens can physically see and feel its power. This is political theater, the deliberate gamification of authority. Whether a ruler wants to appease a restless mob or crush a political rival, the physical stage offers a tool far sharper than any sword. The Roman Empire mastered this projection of power. Through events like the elaborate victory parade known as the Roman Triumph and the brutal gladiatorial games, Rome turned state-sponsored awe into an institution. Take a look at this immense structure, the Colosseum. Maintaining a venue this massive, importing exotic animals from across the world, and housing thousands of fighters required staggering wealth. The empire essentially acted as a vast entertainment provider. This diagram highlights how calculated these events were. A lightly armored retiarius, armed with a net and trident, was deliberately paired against a heavily armored securator. These mismatched fights generated maximum dramatic tension, proving the battles were organized theatrical productions rather than chaotic bloodbaths. At the center of it all was the emperor, seen here in this statue of Augustus Caesar, raising a hand in absolute authority. He acted as the ultimate director, able to grant life or deliver death with a single gesture based on the crowd's unified reaction. Rome spent massive fortunes on these games to secure a political transaction. By delivering unmatched spectacles, they bought mass loyalty through a calculated mix of terror and awe. When the Roman Empire fractured, that vast wealth and the massive arenas disappeared. So how do you project power when you don't have the budget for a Colosseum? In medieval Europe, authorities turned to a decentralized, hyper-local system of justice. Instead of grand spectacles, they engineered punishments to be cheap, highly visible, and driven entirely by the local community. If you drank too much and caused a disturbance, you might find yourself wearing the drunkard's cloak. You were shoved inside a heavy wooden barrel with holes cut for your head and arms, turning you into a walking, ridiculous spectacle. Look closely at this iron head cage, known as the Branks bridle. It features a flat spiked plate that pressed directly down on the wearer's tongue. Devices like this were engineered specifically to permanently mark and silence social disruptors within a closed village system. These punishments relied on mandatory participation. With devices like the cucking stool, where an offender was dunked in a river, Or the whipping carousel, which spun the victim for equal viewing angles. The community itself became part of the machinery. As you can see in this recreation, crowds enthusiastically hurled rotten vegetables and mocked the offender. The state provided the physical framework, but the villagers supplied the actual punishment. This interactive model served a dual purpose. It punished the offender, but it also terrorized the audience. By joining in, the villagers internalized the rules and clearly understood the social destruction waiting for them if they stepped out of line. Medieval justice maintained social order by turning neighbors against each other. The persistent fear of public humiliation proved to be incredibly effective at keeping people in check. Now look at these towering stone fortress walls. Inside structures like this, the Crusader states in the Holy Land demonstrated how theatrical display could be used to conquer a room without shedding a single drop of blood. In the great halls of Jerusalem and Antioch, lavish banquets were deployed as diplomatic weapons. These events were carefully staged to forge fragile alliances with visiting rivals and foreign envoys. This illuminated manuscript depicts a grand banquet. The host and favored guests sit at an elevated high table, visually mapping the room's social hierarchy. The vast arrays of food, gold vessels, and fine wines sent a clear, intimidating message of absolute resource control. The physical tools have evolved. The gladiatorial arenas have crumbled, the iron cages sit in museums, and the great halls are empty. But the underlying mechanics of performed authority remain completely unchanged. We still map out our social hierarchies at state dinners, project invincibility through synchronized military parades, and enforce public accountability during highly publicized, televised congressional hearings. The ancient sets have fallen to ruin, but the theatrical playbook of power is still actively directing the show. History is often remembered as a series of violent conquests, but a sword swung hard enough will eventually shatter. Brute force is a brittle way to build a future. The people who actually endured the chaos of the past did so by active design. They engineered survival through specific, calculated systems, the mechanics of resilience. Understanding our presence in the modern world requires looking away from the battlefield and toward the physical, political, and psychological tools humans invented to stay alive and stay sane. In the Paleolithic era, waking up was a survival calculation. The weather, the wildlife, and the flora were all potential threats that required a constant, exhausting defense. While the hunting party focused on the mammoth, the cave woman engineered the tribe's daily survival. She functioned as a field medic, a full-time bodyguard to toddlers, and the primary gatherer, meticulously sorting a valley's worth of biodiversity into calories and cures. Her most relentless burden was firekeeping. This required kneeling over a fire pit for hours, coaxing smoke from damp wood with blistered hands. If that flame died, the family lost their primary defense against predators and the cold. Mastering local flora required a rigorous oral database of chemical properties, distinguishing a life-saving root from a lethal twin through generations of documented evidence. This systematic observation of nature provided the earliest framework for human scientific inquiry. She was the memory keeper. At night, she turned grueling lessons into stories and warnings to educate the next generation. On the stone walls, the tribes stamped their hands and painted their world, leaving a permanent manual for those who followed. Humanity persisted through the cave woman's daily engineering of physical resilience, a constant, grueling defense against an environment that never stopped looking for a gap in her fire or her focus. By the Middle Ages, agriculture had stabilized physical survival, but it introduced the new threat of social volatility. Managing massive, diverse populations required strict systems of order. Falconry served as a visible map of social class, from emperors flying massive gyfalcons to knights handling peregrines. Every bird on a wrist signaled a person's exact place in the feudal hierarchy.
Training these birds required months of weighing meat and building trust with an apex predator. This ability to command a wild animal to hunt and return provided a physical demonstration of a noble's power to enforce order over the untamed. In the Levant, the Kurdish general Saladin faced a different kind of chaos. He realized that a unified Muslim world required more than just dominance. It required the stability of a predictable moral code. When Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187, he broke the cycle of massacre that had defined the Crusades. He permitted safe passage, accepted ransoms for the poor, and kept the city's holy sites intact, proving that mercy could be a more effective tool of governance than blood. Whether it was the rigid hierarchy of the falconer's glove or the strict code of chivalry at the gates of Jerusalem, both systems provided a blueprint for survival. They transformed a volatile world into a place of predictable rules and enforceable order. But strict systems of order create an immense psychological burden. In the Middle Ages, the constant pressure of feudal hierarchy and religious piety could become unbearable. To prevent this pressure from leading to rebellion, society relied on the release valve of carnival. For a brief period before the austerity of Lent, the established rules were intentionally abandoned. During these festivities, the hierarchy was inverted. Choir boys were crowned as mock popes, peasants mocked their lords, and the entire community engaged in a mandatory, explosive period of gluttony. Wearing a mask effectively deleted a person's social history. This temporary anonymity allowed citizens to safely vent their dangerous frustrations and mock authority without fear of retribution once the festival ended. The ruling class tolerated this madness because they understood that long-term societal order was only possible if you occasionally allowed the community to explode in a controlled, symbolic revolt. The cave woman's fire, the nobleman's falcon, the sultan's mercy, and the peasant's mask are all interconnected survival technologies. Our ancestors were the active architects of their reality, constantly engineering new ways to counter whatever flavor of chaos threatened their existence. The true legacy of history persists in our ingenious ability to build a fire, rewrite the rules of social order, and find a way to celebrate in the dark. Picture a muddy village square in 13th century Europe. A priest drops a communion wafer, and it appears to bleed. The crowd falls to its knees, terrified by what they assume is a direct message from God. Now cut to 17th century Kyoto. Inside a softly lit tea house, a woman with a stark white face and heavy silk robes pours green tea with such precise, calculated silence that the simple act feels like a sacred ritual. These two moments look entirely unrelated, but they share the exact same root cause: utter powerlessness. For most of history, human beings lived at the absolute mercy of their environment. A sudden plague could empty a city in weeks. A long winter meant mass starvation, and rigid social hierarchies locked nearly everyone into the exact station where they were born, with zero hope of escape. But humans do not accept chaos quietly. When the universe refuses to provide order, we manufacture it. We build elaborate mythologies to explain the unexplainable. We design strict daily rituals to fend off the decay of time, and when our bodies belong to the state or a master, we invent intense, hyper-controlled art forms to claim ownership over our own minds. It is easy to look back at exploding tombs, bleeding bread, and restrictive corsets as proof that our ancestors were ignorant or superstitious. That gets the story backwards. These myths, rituals, and strict artistic disciplines were brilliant, desperate strategies. They were the tools humanity engineered to survive the terrifying chaos of being alive. Take that bleeding bread in medieval Europe. When a priest in Bolsena, Italy, saw his communion wafer oozing a red liquid in 1263, he didn't wonder if he'd cut his finger. He rushed the cloth to the Pope, who immediately declared it a miracle. The church poured massive amounts of capital into constructing Orvieto Cathedral, effectively building a giant stone reliquary to commemorate a morsel of sanctified bread.
Modern microbiologists have a much simpler explanation. A cheerful red bacterium called Serratia marcescens thrives on moist bread and produces a bright red pigment. The blood of Christ was a textbook case of food poisoning. But medieval clergy didn't know what bacteria was. In their logic, anything that defied immediate explanation had to be either demonic or divine. This exact logic applied when a wealthy bishop was laid to rest under the floor of a hot stone cathedral in midsummer. A few weeks later, his tomb violently cracked open, releasing a horrific stench. Witnesses thought his soul was escaping purgatory. The church quickly branded it divine punishment for his greed. Science tells us that a corpse sealed tightly in a lead coffin will rapidly swell with methane gas until the pressure forces it to explode. Without germ theory, people blame disease on miasma, the idea that bad, foul-smelling air literally carried death. To survive, they designed terrifying physical adaptations. The iconic plague doctor mask featured a long, hollow beak stuffed with herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth. They believed filtering out the scent of death would keep the lungs pure. The waxed leather coats offered slight protection against fleas, but the masks did nothing to stop the plague. That didn't matter. When an entire society lacks the vocabulary to explain a biological threat, they construct a mythology around it. Exploding tombs and demonic miasmas provided an explanation, and an explanation, even a terrifying one, creates a psychological sense of control over death. While priests were fighting demons, peasants were fighting the clock. Before the first frost, survival came down to a brutal mathematical calculation: how to make a harvest last through the winter. Without refrigeration, bread molded, milk quickly soured, and fresh meat rotted in days. Halting biological decay was an absolute necessity. The most potent weapon against this decay was salt. It draws out moisture, robbing bacteria of the damp environment they require to multiply. Salt was so critical that human societies built massive underground infrastructure to extract it. Deep inside the Wieliczka salt mine, the timber supports of the Casimir the Great chamber show the industrial scale required to harvest this white gold. If salt was scarce, peasants turned to fire. They hung slabs of pork and mutton from rafters, letting curls of wood smoke wash over the protein for weeks. The compounds released by burning wood acted as chemical armor, killing bacteria and turning raw pink flesh into dark, leathery rations that could hang safely in a cellar until February. Preserving food demanded relentless, exhausting labor. Women and children tended smokehouses day and night, their eyes stinging and clothes reeking of ash. Neighbors shared tools, ovens, and precious vinegar to cure and pickle their crops. It was a communal war against starvation. By forcing nature's timeline to pause, isolated villages bought themselves another season of life. At the top of the social hierarchy, survival looked completely different. While peasants worried about full cellars, the nobility obsessed over bloodlines and borders. For kings and dukes, the greatest threat wasn't winter. It was a rival kingdom or a failing dynasty. Look at this diagram. It shows exactly how medieval marriage actually functioned. It was not a romantic union. It was a highly calculated political contract. Two noble houses merged their assets, land, armies, gold, through a central, locked marriage knot. A French princess might be shipped to England at 14 to secure a peace treaty. Leverage always overruled affection. The Catholic Church claimed these vows were permanent, but when an alliance stopped being useful, the powerful exploited legal loopholes. Kings requested annulments on grounds of consanguinity, claiming the bride and groom were distant cousins, or argued the marriage was never physically consummated. Once the church decree severed the knot, the assets were immediately redirected to a more advantageous house.
The nobility took the most sacred, binding ritual in their culture and turned it into an entirely negotiable asset. Social survival meant writing treaties in silk and blood, proving that those with enough power will always find a way to rewrite the rules. Sometimes physical escape is impossible. By the 17th century, Japan's shogun had achieved peace, but locked the country into a strict, inescapable caste system. Vice and pleasure were strictly regulated, confined behind the walls of licensed pleasure quarters like Kyoto's Shimamara and later Gyeonmachi. Inside these walls existed the ukiyo, the floating world. Here, the highest-ranking courtesans, the oiran, transformed their captivity into a theater of extreme refinement. Their appearance alone required immense physical discipline. They wore heavy, armor-like layers of silk and elaborate hairstyles packed with sharp pins, forcing them to move with slow, deliberate grace, demanding total control. Eventually, the geisha evolved from this culture, shifting the focus away from physical transactions toward absolute artistic mastery. In the tea house, every movement was choreographed. From the angle of a poured cup of tea to the precise physical distance maintained between the geisha and her patron, the interaction was based entirely on strict boundaries, not intimacy. Their livelihood depended on maintaining a delicate balance. A geisha offered the illusion of romance and the comfort of conversation, but she remained emotionally untouchable. She was a confidant to powerful samurai and wealthy merchants, reading the room and controlling the atmosphere with a perfectly timed smile or a simple note on the shamisen. Beneath the painted serenity was a life of debt and relentless performance. But through this extreme discipline, the women of the floating world engineered a perfect psychological illusion. Denied physical and political freedom, they built a domain where they dictated the rules of engagement. The peasant salting a pork leg in a smoky cellar, the king plotting an annulment to save his dynasty, and the geisha perfectly pouring a cup of tea seem separated by light years of culture and class. Yet they are all engaged in the exact same human behavior. They are asserting agency. When the universe refuses to provide order, we use myth, ritual, and art to write the rules of our own existence. We draw lines in the dirt. We categorize the chaos. We invent routines that make the unpredictable feel manageable. We do the exact same thing today. Every strict morning routine, every digital metric we obsess over, every carefully curated online persona, these are modern iterations of the exact same survival mechanisms. We are still building illusions and rituals to make sense of a chaotic world. And just like our ancestors, we are surviving it together.
When we picture the ancient world, we imagine serene temples, refined banquets, and glorious expansions. But their survival carried a dark, logistical cost. A tiny elite had to find ways to control massive populations, command entire economies, and maintain firm control over vast territories. Today, were purchased through the systemic exploitation of ordinary people, via three specific mechanisms: ritual, labor, and warfare. While imposing, this brick ziggurat functioned as a central bureaucratic hub for the Mesopotamian state. This ancient clay tablet details a barley-based economy. If a family couldn't afford a proper dowry, they essentially surrendered their daughters to the temple for a tax write-off. Initiation into the role of kadeshu meant surrendering bodily autonomy and personal boundaries to the state. The daily reality for these young women involved existing in filth on old mats, surrounded by livestock, and performing unconsenting public fertility rites with local merchants who paid their fees in grain. The elite priests and state officials took notes, amassed vast resources, and maintained social order by framing these transactions as divine requirements. These records reveal a temple system that functioned as a designed mechanism to stabilize the male populace, enrich the priesthood, and categorize women as state property. This traditional Chinese palace architecture represents the epicenter of imperial rule. The emperor projected unmatched authority by demonstrating command over both nature and human bodies.
Consider the imperial consumption of exotic foods like bird's nest soup or shark fin. Acquiring these ingredients was a form of political theater, requiring peasants to risk their lives scaling sheer cliffs or braving deep ocean currents. These banquets proved to the court that the emperor's logistical mastery could extract tribute from the farthest corners of the world. These vast ranks of life-size terracotta soldiers represent a staggering extraction of labor. Qin Shi Huang consumed massive human effort for his subterranean project. 700,000 conscripted laborers, prisoners, and artisans were forced into decades of work to build a replica of the state for the afterlife. Looking at these fragmented terracotta soldiers lying in the dirt, we see the shattered lives of the laborers. The state trapped or killed the very artisans who built the tomb to ensure the project's secrets remained buried. Chinese imperial authority was maintained by its ability to consume the labor, health, and lives of its subjects, even into death. This rocky coastline meeting the Adriatic Sea highlights a scarcity of arable land, forcing the Illyrians to turn to the water for their survival. This geographic necessity birthed a culture of piracy. Utilizing swift lembus ships, leaders like Queen Tota turned coastal raiding into a legitimate economic engine. This decentralized, survival-based economy became a direct threat to the structured, expanding trade network of the Roman Republic. These ruins of the Roman Forum represent the political machine where the response was calculated. Rome systematically dismantled Illyrian independence and their naval culture. The motivations were distinct. The Illyrians fought for survival. Rome enforced a commercial monopoly. Rome's pacified trade routes and expansion were built on the deliberate annihilation of any independent culture that existed outside the state's control. Mesopotamia, China, and Rome used different tools to achieve the same goal: state supremacy over the individual. Going forward, we should reframe how we view the legacy of Intipli. The monuments and artifacts we celebrate are essentially crime scenes of mass exploitation. Underneath the poetic hymns, the exotic banquets, and the military conquests is the reality of blisters, flat beer, and broken bodies. The foundation of the civilized ancient world was the ruthless, systemic consumption of ordinary people.